My name is Avery. I'm 36 years old and currently live with my husband on a small farm just outside of Colorado. To outsiders, I'm just another city girl gone country. But no one really knows I once graduated top of my class in environmental biology. I had offers from major research institutes. But I chose love over titles, chose to plant real seeds over chasing hollow dreams. And because of that, not once did my family ever lift their heads to see me as one of their own. At my parents' 60th wedding anniversary party, amid clinking glasses and shallow conversations about real estate investments, my sister Madison stood up, raised her wine glass, and smiled slyly. To Avery and her, soil-loving soulmate, may your vegetables grow taller than your ambitions ever did. The whole room erupted in laughter. No one flinched under my steady gaze. I smiled. Just a little. But something inside me cracked. I didn't need to respond with words. Because deep down, I knew one day, if they would come knocking. And when that moment came, I'd leave them outside in the rain, just where they had left me for all those years. Have you ever been looked down on by your own family because of your choices? Have you ever swallowed harsh words in silence just to keep the peace? Leave a comment if you've ever been the disappointment in your family's eyes. Hit like if you believe that sometimes, living true to yourself is the strongest answer you can give. Subscribe to the channel to follow the rest of this story because, after they laughed in my face, a few years later, they'll be the ones knocking on my door, eyes full of desperation. And what happens next? You'll never see coming. I stood there, in a ballroom glowing with crystal chandeliers and imported fresh flowers, hearing the waves of laughter roll out from Madison's table all the way to the far end of the hall, where a jazz band played a silky tune no one cared to listen to. Relatives from both sides of the family, the same people who had taken turns judging every choice I'd ever made, now chuckled with satisfaction at a sugar-coated insult. I kept my smile. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I was used to it. Madison sat back down, tracing her finger along the rim of her wine glass like she'd just delivered an award-winning performance. My mother, Diane, let out a long sigh and nodded gently, as if to smooth things over, but in her eyes, I saw it clearly, that quiet relief. As if I had once again ruined the perfect image she worked so hard to maintain. Cole sat next to me, still silent. He didn't look at me or speak up. He just quietly held my hand under the table, his thumb slowly tracing soft circles on my skin, calm, patient, like the way he tends the soil every morning in the East Field. I sipped water. No wine. I needed clarity more than pride drowned in alcohol. Madison raised her glass again, to toast Brandon, our younger brother, who had just been promoted to branch director of a bank in San Diego. Brandon has always been the family's pride, Madison said, her voice perfectly projected. Unlike some people who choose to dig dirt instead of digging their way up in life. A few scattered chuckles followed. Someone cleared their throat awkwardly. I glanced at Mom, but Diane just took another sip of her wine, eyes drifting to the ceiling as if she hadn't heard a thing. I suddenly remembered a night 10 years ago, when I came home with my honors degree in environmental biology from Berkeley. I thought that night she'd hug me, be proud. But all I got was a glance and the words, "What do you plan to do with all that dirt and plant theory? Go teach in some rural school?" Now, I do teach at a public high school in Greeley. And every afternoon after class, I come home to help Cole harvest organic vegetables, manage our drip irrigation system, and analyze soil nutrient data. In that little house next to the field, I've never felt out of place. Only in places like this, with fake laughter and double-edged compliments, do I feel like I don't belong. You okay? Cole leaned in, whispering gently in my ear. I'm fine, I said, keeping my voice steady, just counting how many people are laughing without their eyes. He squeezed my hand a little tighter. Let them laugh. One day they'll need someone who knows how to dig deeper. His words seemed simple, but I knew he wasn't just talking about farming. He meant truth, the kind that lives deep under all the polished layers my family loves to wear like a paper-thin shield. Brandon launched into a story about a recent business trip to New York, where he networked with industry leaders, and was now considering opening a private financial firm. My mom nodded proudly. Madison chimed in with the names of celebrities she had happened to meet at her recent media conference. I sat there, listening, without really listening. And Avery? My mother suddenly turned to me, her tone slightly hesitant. You're still teaching somewhere, right? Roosevelt High School in Greeley, I replied, trying to stay light. Oh, she nodded, lips tight. That sounds stable. Then she turned away, as if the conversation had ended, as if it didn't matter what I taught, who I taught, or what I'd accomplished. She teaches biology, Madison jumped in. So that means showing kids how to plant beans and test soil pH, right? Another round of laughter. Even a few unfamiliar guests chuckled along like they really knew who I was. I placed my water glass back on the table and looked directly at my sister. We're running an integrated farming simulation on arid soil microbiomes, I said. My 11th graders just successfully modeled how mycorrhizal fungi retain root moisture. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Madison raised her eyebrows. Sounds impressive, she said, clearly not understanding a word. I teach them to see soil as a living ecosystem, not just something we walk on and forget, I continued. Just like I've learned that some words, no matter how foul, can still decompose into something that helps growth. Cole chuckled softly, just for the two of us. Madison didn't respond. She turned to whisper something to her husband, and I noticed Brandon looking at me over his wine glass. His expression no longer carried the smugness I remembered. Maybe it was confusion, maybe fear. I began to feel something shifting, like a wind over the field, signaling early rain, not from the ones still laughing, but from the silence after each jab, a longer than usual pause, a glance that didn't meet mine, a sigh too heavy to be casual. I'd learned to read signs like those. Living close to nature, close to soil, makes you sensitive to the slightest changes. And I had a feeling. What was coming? I wouldn't be more jokes. It would be desperation. And when that moment arrived, I wouldn't need revenge. I'd let them see themselves. In the mirror, in my eyes, in the land they once mocked. And in the seeds I quietly planted, waiting to bloom. I still remember the final senior assembly back in high school, when all our classmates stood up one by one to share their dreams. Madison said she wanted to work for a global media empire, wear white suits, and fly between cities like New York, Paris, and Tokyo. Brandon declared he'd be a CEO before he turned 30. And me, the curly-haired girl in the back row who always took notes on leaf structure and soil microbes, I simply said, I want to learn how to save the soil before it can no longer save us. The whole class laughed. The homeroom teacher nodded with indulgence, as if encouraging a child clinging to a dream too naive to last. But I didn't laugh. I looked at the blackboard then and silently thought, one day the very soil they see as filthy will save them from things money can never buy. When I was 18, I received a full scholarship to the University of California, Berkeley, majoring in environmental biology. I was the only student in my high school to get such a prestigious award, yet no one in my family considered it an achievement. At that time, Madison was interning at a big advertising firm in Chicago. She called and said, "Environmental biology? I thought you'd become a doctor or an engineer, not a vegetable expert." I simply answered, "I'm not growing vegetables. I study the underground ecosystem." Madison burst out laughing on the phone. "The more you explain, the more it sounds like you're chatting with earthworms." My mother stayed silent. She never openly opposed me, but she had her own way of making me feel her disappointment. A cold nod, a distracted gaze, or a murmured line as if speaking to herself. Having a child at a so-called great school, yet none of my friends even know the name. What's there to be proud of? In the family photos on the wall, I wasn't in them. At my college graduation, my parents didn't come. My mother said Madison had an important presentation in Manhattan, and Brandon was busy preparing to buy a house, so traveling wasn't convenient. I sat alone in the schoolyard, clutching a bouquet I had bought for myself, watching classmates hug their parents while my heart sank to the ground. But it was right there, among the trees planted to filter the air, that I met Cole, a senior in agricultural engineering, wearing faded jeans and always carrying a notebook filled with root structures. He sat down next to me, didn't ask anything, only said, "You don't need anyone here. We're already standing in the middle of a forest." I laughed. And from that moment on, I never felt alone again. Cole didn't come from a wealthy family. His father passed away early. His mother worked as a nurse in the countryside. But to me, no one had ever listened to the earth the way he did. He could look at a tiny crack in a field and tell how the moisture had shifted in the past week. He didn't talk much, but every word he spoke felt steeped in careful thought. After graduation, I turned down an offer from a research institute in Washington, D.C. I chose instead to live with Cole in a small Colorado suburb, where he had just bought 7 acres of land. The land wasn't flat, had no irrigation system, and weeds grew taller than our knees. But when I stepped onto it, lifted a handful of soil to my nose, and inhaled the damp scent of organic humus, I knew this was the beginning. We made a plan to restore the soil using sustainable organic farming. I applied the knowledge I had gathered in college to test natural microbes that helped the soil retain water longer. Cole designed a drip irrigation system out of recycled materials. Every morning, we woke with the sun, worked until late afternoon, then had dinner under the porch with vegetables we grew ourselves. During that time, my family completely cut off contact. No texts, no calls, not a single inquiry. I heard Brandon got married in Napa Valley. I wasn't invited. No one even told me. Madison was interviewed in a business magazine, showing off family photos in their Manhattan penthouse. I wasn't in the frame. The only time I was mentioned was in a joke Brandon made to a friend that I overheard while visiting Grandma. Avery? Oh, the girl growing vegetables on the fringes of society. I didn't get angry. I just smiled and walked back to the car. I knew they didn't want me in the family portrait they were painting, and I no longer wanted to force myself into it either. One summer, when our kale field was ready for the first harvest, I held Cole's hand, standing on the brown soil that had come alive again, and said, "No matter what they say out there, here, I have everything." He didn't answer. He just handed me a small shovel and pointed to the far corner of the garden. "Let's plant plum trees here. By the 3rd year, they'll bear fruit." I looked at him, said nothing, and started digging. The following years, our life was steady and slow. I taught at the local high school, helping kids understand food, microbes, and soil as a living entity. Cole kept working on small automation systems to optimize farming on harsh land. We didn't post anything online. No showing off. No rushing to expand. But each season added a bit more hope. Each plant we grew sowed a little more confidence. And I started to forget the feeling of being left out. Until the laughter at that dinner party dragged me back. Once again, I was called odd by the very people who once decided I wasn't worthy of being in the family picture. But unlike before, I was no longer the girl desperate for approval. I was the woman who had built her own land to stand firm on. And when they turned, to look at me even just to laugh, I knew every seed I had planted had begun to sprout. That day was a quiet Tuesday morning in mid-April. I was checking the drip irrigation in the patch of bok choy when my phone rang in my jacket pocket. The sound made me pause. Hardly anyone called me at that hour, unless it was the school reporting an incident or a neighbor warning of a power outage. I wiped my hands on my jeans and pulled out the phone. The screen showed a name I had nearly forgotten: Brandon. I froze for a few seconds, my palms dampened with sweat. How long had it been since the last time my younger brother called me directly? 5 years? Maybe 6? In the past, if there was any contact, it was my mother's cold messages or stiff nods at crowded parties. Never a direct call, never a, "How are you?" I looked at the screen for another beat, then answered. "Hello?" "Avery." Brandon's voice came through, lacking the arrogance it usually carried. It sounded cut off, insecure. "It's me. I hope you have time. I need to talk." I turned to look at the young apple trees sprouting fresh green leaves. You call me after all these years. To talk about what? There was a long sigh on the other end. My bank is under investigation. Some investment accounts, the financial regulators think there are violations. I can't say too much over the phone, but you should know because I stayed silent. Brandon stopped. Because they may contact the whole family. Family? I repeated. You mean the people who forgot I existed for more than half a decade? I didn't mean it like that. His voice dropped. Can you meet me? Just once. I want to explain clearly. I swallowed hard. The smell of damp soil after watering still lingered in the air. Fine, but you have to come here. To the farm? Yes. If you want to talk, come to the place you once called that vegetable patch on. The fringe of society. Brandon was silent for a few seconds. Then I heard him exhale. All right. Saturday morning. Bring coffee, I said, eyes still fixed on the horizon. Out here we only have mint tea and filtered rainwater. After hanging up, I stood still for a long while. Dirt still clung to the spaces between my fingers, something I cherished as if it were part of myself. But something else was stirring inside me like weeds sprouting between neat rows of crops. That afternoon, I opened my phone and scrolled through social media, a habit I had long abandoned. Yet somehow today I felt the urge. Madison's profile popped up first. Her newest post was a blurred black and white photo of a hand clutching a wine glass, captioned simply, "Not every betrayal comes from a stranger." Below were hundreds of comments, most from colleagues in the media industry, slyly inquiring, tagging Elijah Madison's husband. I scrolled quickly. A few comments hinted at investment ties, accounts being affected, systems under heavy audit. I turned off the screen and set the phone down on the table. Inside me was both confusion and something akin to intuition. A storm was coming, from a direction I never thought would circle back. 3 days later, while I was teaching my second period class on food chains and ecosystems, my phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. When I finally stepped out, I saw the messages from Mom. Call when you're free. Family matter, urgent. I stared at those words and felt a strange distance. How long had it been since she last sent me a message like that? And stranger still, that word family was only invoked now, when there was trouble. That evening, while I was cleaning the kitchen, Cole walked in with a basket of fresh eggs. He looked at me, eyes quietly questioning. Anything new today? I nodded. Mom texted. Said there's something we need to discuss. Cole set the basket on the counter, washed his hands, and said evenly, "What do you think she wants?" I'm not sure yet. But I have a feeling they're not calling just to boast about achievements. He wiped his hands on the towel hanging by the sink, then turned back to me. I told you once, didn't I? One day, they'll come knocking. Not to invite you in, but to beg for shelter under your roof when the storm breaks. I looked at him for a long time. In that moment, I understood. Something had begun to fracture not from me, but from the very people who once laughed in my face, and the storm had already started to blow its first winds. That Sunday, the sky held no rain, but neither did the sun bring warmth. Thick gray clouds hung heavy like a curtain that shut out all comfort. Cole and I left the farm at 11 a.m., carrying a jar of homemade peach preserves, a gesture of politeness. On the drive, neither of us spoke much. Cole kept his eyes on the road, while I gazed out the window, now and then, counting the bare fields sliding away behind us. When we turned onto the street leading to my parents' old house, I noticed Cole gripping the wheel just a bit tighter. The 3-story red brick home still stood there, proud and symmetrical, as if it had never witnessed the cracks in our family's foundation. But I saw signs others might overlook: peeling paint on the window frames, grass in the front yard grown wild, curtains no longer white as I remembered. As we stepped onto the porch, the door opened. My mother Diane stood there in a beige turtleneck sweater, her face carefully made up but unable to hide the pallor beneath the powder. She smiled, a practiced smile I had known since childhood. "Avery, you're here," she said, then glanced at Cole. "Hello, Cole." "Hello, Mom," I replied, softly, almost like small talk, then stepped inside. The air inside was stifling in an odd way. No scent of baked goods like before, no soft jazz floating from the speakers. Only the steady tick-tock of the wall clock. My father sat in the main chair of the living room, dressed in a white shirt, holding a teacup he clearly wasn't drinking from. Brandon stood by the window, arms folded, eyes evasive. Madison was already perched on the sofa, wearing a long green dress, legs crossed with practiced poise, yet her fingers nervously tugged at the edge of the tablecloth. Cole and I sat in the two chairs placed opposite them. Silence stretched, heavy and long. No greetings, no polite inquiries about health or work, just silence. Finally, my father spoke. "We asked you here today because there's something important we need to discuss." I leaned forward slightly. "What is it, Dad?" Madison cut in before he could answer. "It's about the land. Your farm." Cole straightened, his eyes moving quickly, but he said nothing. I turned to Madison. "What about the farm?" Brandon stepped closer, resting his hands on the back of the sofa. "You know, lately, agricultural land prices in that area have risen a lot. Some investors are interested in that region." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And how does that connect to this so-called family matter?" Mom nodded gently, her face softening as if preparing to present something reasonable. "We're in an unstable economy, and there may be choices we need to consider for the long-term future." "What choices, Mom?" Cole spoke. His voice wasn't raised, but every word landed clear. "You're talking about selling our farm, aren't you?" No one answered. Madison took a breath, propped her hand on her knee, and looked directly at me. "We think maybe this is a good chance for the whole family to get through this tough time together." "Tough time?" I repeated. My brother was just promoted to branch manager at his bank. "You still live in an apartment overlooking Central Park. Mom and Dad still host anniversary parties at restaurants, where dinner starts at $300 a plate. And you call that tough times?" Brandon lowered his head. Madison turned away. My father set his teacup down. Diane looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something rare in her eyes. Worry. "We're facing financial trouble." I stayed silent. The moment dragged like an old film frame stuck in place. "Brandon's bank," Mom continued, "is under investigation for misappropriated investments. The IRS has stepped in. Some accounts have been frozen. And the house may be forced into a new mortgage." I glanced at Cole. He sat still, eyes steady. Madison leaned forward, her voice urgent. "But if we sell your farm, the only property untouched by debt or dispute, we could solve almost everything." I let out a small laugh. "We?" Brandon stepped closer, his tone low. "Avery, I know the things I said, the way I acted, weren't fair. But it's serious. I just want you to think about the family." Cole turned to me, his gaze calm and deliberate. I took a deep breath and set the jar of peach preserves on the table. "You invited us here to plead for the sale of what we call home, our life, 10 years of labor. But you dressed it up in words like partnership, opportunity, and land value. If you truly cared about family, the least you could have started with was an apology." No one spoke. No one argued back. I rose from my chair, my eyes moving across each of them. "Thank you for having us here today to confirm what I've long suspected. When reputation is no longer enough to cover the cracks, people turn to the land. But unfortunately, my land is not for sale." I turned to leave, but before stepping over the threshold, I stopped and glanced back at Madison, who was staring at the jar of jam I had just placed down. "I brought peach jam. If anyone here is kind enough to eat it, remember that every single fruit in there was grown from the very soil you all once called worthless, just like me." I walked out of that house without looking back, not out of anger, but because I knew that if I turned around, I would see too many years when I had once wished to belong there. Now I no longer needed that. And perhaps it was them who were finally beginning to understand what it felt like to be left outside. That evening, after leaving my parents' house, Cole and I drove home in silence. The streetlights streamed across the windshield, casting streaks of gold that flickered over the steering wheel. My heart was still echoing with the words from that conversation, every avoided glance, every excuse that rolled off their tongues like lines they had rehearsed. I had thought I was prepared not to hurt anymore, not to be surprised, not to flinch each time someone used the word family like a pardon card. But what made my throat tighten was not their plea, it was my mother's eyes. She still looked at me the same way, with the gaze of someone who never truly believed I was worth anything. Even today, when they needed me, she couldn't hide that look. When we arrived home, Cole didn't say a word. He quietly went into the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and sat at the table. I took off my shoes, hung my coat, then walked over to him. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice hoarse from the long day. He looked up, calm. "For what?" "For dragging you into a mess you didn't deserve. I once thought that if I stayed quiet, if I just lived decently, no one would have a reason to hurt us anymore." He handed me a glass of water, his fingers brushing lightly against my wrist. "Avery," he said slowly, "you have nothing to be sorry for. The only thing you've done is keep your promise to yourself, never to turn back for people who never walked a step with you." I stayed quiet, sipped the water, and leaned back against the chair. Cole reached into a drawer and pulled out a light brown folder, the kind he rarely touched. I realized he had been holding on to it for a while. He set the file on the table and slid it toward me. "I was going to wait a little longer," he said, his voice lower now. "But I think today is the right time." I frowned. "What is it?" "Do you remember the soil rehabilitation project we started in the East Corner?" I nodded. "We began it 2 years ago, when we discovered a plot of abandoned land with abnormally high salt content in the topsoil. I wanted to pass on it, but Cole had said, if we can save this, then maybe saline-prone lands in the Midwest could have a chance too." He opened the file, pulling out a stack of neatly clipped documents stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. "The Federal Agricultural Research Division has agreed to partner with us," he said, eyes still fixed on the papers. "They've granted us $3 million over 3 years to develop salt-resistant crops, along with building a closed-loop regenerative farming model." I didn't react right away. I just stared at him, as if I had misheard. $3 million? The first installment has already hit the company's account. 25% is allocated for on-site lab infrastructure. The rest will be released according to research milestones. And the department requires us to keep operations right here, on this land. I took the documents, my eyes catching on familiar terms and figures. Salinity threshold, root development stability, microbial integration trials. It felt like each line was pounding directly against my chest. "You kept this from me?" "Not kept," he replied, carefully organizing the papers again. I stayed silent until it was certain. "I wanted to show you that it's not only outsiders who misjudge you. Sometimes, even you forget what you're standing on." I blinked several times, overwhelmed and on the verge of tears. "Our farm," I whispered, "it's no longer just a place to grow vegetables." Cole looked up at me, his gaze gentle. "It never was just a place to grow vegetables. It's the place where you've turned everything others dismissed into something to be proud of." I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the land they once mocked as a mud patch lay still under the warm glow of the porch light. I saw rows of kale still green despite the cold wind. The small shed to the left where Cole had installed the automated irrigation system, where my students once came for field practice. And for the first time, I saw more clearly than ever that we had never been just farmers. We were people sowing the future that others lacked the patience to see. Cole came to stand behind me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Do you want to tell them about this?" I was silent for a moment, then shook my head. "No, they don't deserve to know right now. As long as they still see me as a failure, any truth will only be dismissed as luck." Cole nodded without argument. "Then we wait. But next time they come back, you'll have the right to stand not to beg for acceptance, but to set the terms." I turned to him with a faint smile. They wanted me to sell the farm, but I've realized they don't know we're building a federally backed mobile biolab, Cole chuckled softly. And if they try, we'll show them every layer of soil here is more closely monitored than the assets they once pawned. I leaned against his shoulder, my heart light, like when I first harvested that bundle of greens from the reclaimed soil. But this time, I wasn't just harvesting vegetables. I was harvesting something far more precious, the understanding of my own worth, without needing anyone else's stamp of approval. The question was no longer, do they believe in me? It was, can they handle the truth about me, now that I am no longer the shadow on the edges of the Khan family, but the one holding the land they're standing on to beg for help. 2 weeks after that charged family meeting, no messages came from my mother, no phone calls from Brandon, no word from Madison. The air seemed to have calmed, but I knew silence like this was not peace, it was the pause before a storm. That afternoon, I was planting young eggplants into the saline-treated plot when my phone buzzed. A text from Aaron, my cousin, the only one who stayed in touch sincerely. You should know this. Madison just had an emergency meeting at the company. News is about to leak. I called her back right away. Aaron picked up after just one ring. What happened? I asked. Someone exposed Elijah, Avery. They said he stole original research data work that belonged to a group at the California Plant Institute. Word is, the institute is preparing to file a federal lawsuit. I froze in the garden, the trowel still in my dirt-stained hand. Are you sure? I asked, though. Deep down, I already knew it wasn't a baseless rumor. Madison's company is taking a huge hit, Aaron continued. She skipped the internal hearing yesterday. There's talk that media partners are pulling contracts. Even anonymous complaints have been filed with the board. I hung up after our brief call, my mind spinning. I went inside, washed my hands, and headed straight to the shed. Cole was at the computer, watching a series of charts monitoring soil conductivity. He turned when he heard my steps. I said nothing at first, just handed him my phone with Aaron's message still on the screen. He skimmed it, then set the phone down. Finally it came, Cole said, with no surprise in his voice. I looked at him for a long time. My emotions churned like soil turned over after a rain. How long have you known about this? 4 years, he answered. But the institute told me to stay quiet during the investigation. They wanted enough evidence before filing in court. I sat down across from him, hands clasped together. Which research was it? Cole looked up at me. The genetic mapping for salinity resistance in climate-hardy crop varieties. I submitted the original while I was still at the institute. Elijah was working as a contracted financial officer for the institute at the time. He didn't pay attention, naively assuming the folks handling the books wouldn't touch the research records. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I remembered that packet. I had helped Cole edit the presentation. I remembered nights when he sat at the little wooden table, eyes red, reading and annotating every line of data. Has Madison found out? I asked, my throat tight. Cole nodded. She knows. I think she's the one who filed the anonymous complaint. I was surprised. Madison? Why would she? Because she discovered that all of Elijah's financial success was built on a lie. Worse, it was stolen from the husband of the woman she used to call a failure. I said nothing. Part of me still wanted to believe Madison was only blind, not complicit. We were never close. I never imagined she would sink that low. Has she spoken to you? Cole asked. I shook my head. No. Since that day at our parents' house, she hasn't contacted me. Cole pulled an old envelope from the drawer and took out a copy of the patent, filing his name clearly printed in the upper left corner. Cole D. Atwood Advanced Genomic Mapping for Salinity Resistance in Annual Crops. Beneath it was a note, Confidential Submission Federal Grant Reference Code, AGR 9912. All of it is protected. The institute is ready to go to court, he said, showing me. I ran my fingers over the paper. There was a tightness in my throat. Why didn't you ever tell me? About Elijah. About the theft of your work? Cole was silent for a moment. Because I didn't want you to carry the guilt. I knew you once had feelings for him. I didn't want to pull you into that darkness. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. While others used me as a stepping stone, Cole stayed quiet to protect my heart. That night, I stayed up late, not out of anger, but from a rising sadness. Sad for the years I allowed myself to believe I was the one behind their flashy lives. Sad for Madison, who once had everything yet chose a man like Elijah. And sad for myself for thinking they merely didn't understand me when they had been actively trying to bury me. The next morning, while I was laying a basket of greens out on the porch to dry, a sleek silver car pulled into the lane by the farm gate. The window rolled down and I saw Madison behind the wheel, her hair in a tight bun, sunglasses hiding most of her face. She turned off the engine and climbed out. Her high heels sank into the red dirt. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, waiting for her to speak. Madison removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were red. I need to talk to you, Avery. Her voice was hoarse. I heard Madison's tone without its usual coldness or sarcasm. There was something frayed in it. I nodded slightly and opened the wooden gate. Then come in. But if you bring lies with you, better leave them outside. Madison stepped into my house with none of the poise of the woman who'd once strode confidently through conferences in designer dresses, champagne glass as a prop. Her shoes were muddied, her steps uneven on the hard wooden floor. I handed her a glass of plain water, no sugar, no ice, and set it on the wooden table in the kitchen that smelled of dried cinnamon and mint leaves. We sat facing each other. For nearly a minute, no one spoke. I let her have that moment. When a person breaks, they need a quiet stretch of time before the first cry. You know, Madison began, her voice rough as if she'd been smoking all night. When everything started collapsing, the first person I thought of was you. I looked into her eyes. There was no defiance, no familiar contempt, only a weighty exhaustion like someone who had been swimming in mud and couldn't find the shore. Why? I asked. In my head then, Madison said with a bitter laugh, there was only one image. You out in the corner of the garden, holding a compost bin, hands covered in mud, still smiling. I nodded softly. Because you thought I had nothing to lose, right? People like me always seem fine. She stared at me for a long time. No, because you are the only one in this family who's learned how to stand up after being trampled. And you don't retaliate. I tightened my hands together. Until someone asks to sell everything I built. Madison sighed and leaned back. I know I was wrong, Avery. Mom and Dad were wrong too. But about Elijah, I didn't know. He said it was a team project. That he just compiled the data, not stole it. Is that what he says when he signs? His name onto the research results attributed to my husband? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. Madison looked at the floor and didn't answer. You loved him enough to overlook professional ethics? I pressed. I never imagined it would be like this. Her voice broke. Now, partners are pulling out, our stocks tanking, and media investors are turning away. The press is already hinting at names. The Institute is sending legal notices to our door. I was silent. I had imagined this scene, but seeing it play out left me with no pleasure. Only emptiness, like a proud building in my chest collapsing into dust without a sound. Madison looked up. I didn't come here to ask you for money. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't know where to go. I gazed at her and said softly, if today I were the one at your door, would you open it? The question hung in the air. Madison gripped her glass, eyes closed. Maybe not. I stood up, poured more water without a word. Quietly, as I always do for strangers. You can stay for lunch if you want, I said. But not to discuss property or partnerships. There is nothing to sell here. She nodded, like someone accepting a verdict not from a court but from a part of life she once turned her back on. That afternoon, while I went into the garden to pick tomatoes, my parents' car suddenly pulled in. My mother stepped out first, a long coat wrapped around her, a handbag looped over her elbow, face carefully made up but betraying a nervousness. My father followed, hands in his pockets, moving slower than I remembered. Cole had just returned from the chicken coop, sweat darkening the back of his shirt. He saw them, then went inside to grab a towel to wipe his face, saying nothing. "Daughter," my mother began, her voice softer than usual. "Your father and I need to talk." I looked at her, then at my father, and my gaze landed on Madison stepping out of my house. No one spoke for a few seconds until she continued. "I know things are complicated, but if you still call this family, don't let outsiders pull us further apart." I smiled faintly. "Outsiders? Do you mean Cole? Or the institute that's suing Elijah?" My father cut in, his voice steady though not loud. "If you truly love this family, then help us. Save us from this situation." I looked him straight in the eye and kept my composure. "Loving family doesn't mean sacrificing the life I'm living. You taught me to endure, to make sacrifices, but you never asked whether I was happy." My mother turned away. My father stood motionless, his gaze unfocused. "Madison is right," my mother said, the words like a cold cut. "You're holding grudges, years of silence, and now it's your turn to give it back." I looked directly at her. "If I wanted revenge, do you think I'd have stayed silent for 10 years? I don't need to retaliate. What's happening now isn't because of me. It's the consequence of you always looking down on others and calling that family standards." Madison tried to interrupt, but Cole stepped forward, still in his work clothes, a sprig of just pulled basil in his hand. "We aren't saving anyone," he said clearly, looking at each of them. "We've saved soil, water, and seed stocks for the next generation. But this family has never been on that list." My father opened his mouth as if to respond, then didn't. Nobody reacted. The sun reached its zenith, lighting the faces of the people who had once shadowed my life. They stood there not as pillars of power, but as flesh and blood people, lost and toppled by the very pride they passed down through generations. I stepped back and gently pushed the wooden gate open. "You can come in," I said, "but no one brings conditions." The three of them looked at me not as outsiders this time, but as people holding a key, and, perhaps, they began to understand what it means to stand before a gate they themselves once shut on me. I invited them into the house but didn't follow right away. I stayed at the door, my hand still on the gate as if weighing not the act of opening but what lay beyond it. My little wooden house isn't large. It doesn't have high ceilings or glossy furnishings like the places they used to live in. But to me, every scratch on the table, every mismatched mug, is the mark of a life I chose, not one imposed on me. Cole had set out hot tea at the table and a plate of oatmeal cookies I'd baked that morning in the backwood oven. He sat at the end of the table, quiet like someone keeping time for a wordless conversation. Madison, my mother, and my father sat along the couch. No one spoke when I came in. No one touched the food. I sat down in the chair at the head of the table, facing all three of them. I didn't need to gesture or start with small talk. The air was thick enough for everyone to understand what was coming. I placed my hands on the table and spoke, my voice low but every word hard as stone. "Before we begin talking about land, assets, or what you call family solutions, I want to ask a few questions." No one objected. I looked Madison in the eye. "When I needed someone to come to my graduation, where were you?" Madison stared down at her teacup and said nothing. I turned to my father. "When I was denied my first loan to restore the land and needed a co-signer, what did you say?" My father blinked, voice wavering. "I thought you should do something more practical." I nodded, then faced my mother. "And you? When neighbors mocked me as a brainy girl turned gardener and I texted to ask if I was wrong, did you ever answer?" My mother raised a hand to wipe her eyes. I didn't know what to say. I took a deep breath. "And now, when you've nearly lost everything, when accounts are frozen, when the press is talking about the scandal, you remember me. Not because I'm your child, but because I own a plot of land free of liens. If I had nothing, would you have come?" No one answered. Only the wall clock ticked each second, emphasizing the silence. I stood, pulled a file from the drawer, and took out 3 contracts. Each bore my name and Cole's, clearly labeled, refusal to transfer property. Below were my signatures signed 3 days earlier with our lawyer's certification attached. I placed them on the table as gently as laying down a cloth. "This is my answer," I said, still looking at them. "This land is not for sale, not for debt, and not to buy back anyone's honor who once laughed at me." Madison leaned forward. "Avery, you can't do this. You're destroying the family," I replied without hesitation. "The family was already destroyed when you and our parents decided some people were born to lose." My mother began to sob, small choking sounds. My father sat motionless, his hands trembling. Madison had nothing more to say. Cole, who had been quiet from the start, finally spoke, his voice deep, but edged with a sharpness. "If this family ever truly loved Avery, you would have been here before everything fell apart, not just knocking when the storm hit." My father turned to him slowly. "Cole, maybe we can reconsider. I mean, if Avery is too hurt by the past, at least we could find another way, together." Cole met him calmly, like someone looking at soil waiting to be restored, but he didn't raise his voice. "I don't want everyone to pity Avery. I just want people to understand that quiet, old things, people like her have resilience no one in this family ever noticed." Madison looked away, biting her lip. My mother dabbed her eyes and whispered to herself, "My daughter, I was wrong." I said nothing. I stood and walked out onto the porch and looked over the sunlit garden. From behind me, I heard the best-edited, faint scrape of a chair, the sound of a door opening and closing. I didn't turn back. Cole joined me without asking. He handed me a glass of water, his hand touching my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. Inside me, there was no longer fury, no pain, only the calm of someone who had finally spoken what needed saying. "I'm not refusing out of anger," I said slowly. "I refuse because I won't trade everything we've built just to fix mistakes they never named." Cole said nothing. He simply looked where I was looking, the row of young bok choy, just sprouting, the quiet dreams that had germinated slowly day by day, season by season, with no fanfare and no need for validation. And now, it had become the one thing I would not trade, not even for blood ties. News about Brandon showed up on the morning broadcasts with a cold, brutal headline: "Former High Rock Investment Bank executive indicted for misuse of client accounts." Footage of him stepping out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs, head bowed, played on a TV at the cafe near my house just as I was waiting to pick up 2 cups of hot ginger tea for Cole and me. I stared at the screen, silent. The young barista followed my gaze and quietly asked, "Is he family?" I just smiled softly, gave no answer. That answer didn't need to be spoken. A few days later, an attorney from the Department of Justice contacted me to verify some emails from the time I still had my old address, an address Brandon had once used my name to sponsor certain internal bank transactions. Fortunately, I had changed my address early and had clear evidence that I never signed any documents related to those activities. I sat in the small office at the farm, looking out at the tomato beds just covered with protective netting, feeling grateful that I hadn't turned back or followed the path my family considered proper and something to be proud of. As for Madison, my sister's story, it didn't make the headlines, but it was no less painful. I learned about it from an industry media piece that didn't name names but made the situation clear enough. The luxury cosmetics brand Madison represented abruptly pulled its entire contract and severed ties after discovering that her husband, Elijah, was being sued by a national research institute for stealing intellectual property from a federally funded biological project. Cole said nothing when I showed him the article. He just folded the newspaper back up, set it on the table, and turned to me, speaking softly, as if it were nothing. "They'll have to learn to pay the price, not because I'm punishing them, but because life doesn't let things they once disdained go unaccounted for." After losing their house to pay off the mortgage, my parents moved in with a distant relative in rural Nebraska. I received a short postcard in my mother's handwriting. No apology, no recrimination, just the line. We went the wrong way. But we also raised a child who chose right. I filed the postcard in a small wooden box on the bookshelf, where I keep pieces of memory that aren't always happy but I can't throw away. One afternoon, while I was jotting down soil moisture readings on my tablet in the greenhouse, I received an email from Madison. The subject line said simply, "Sorry." I opened it and read slowly. Madison wrote that she had lost almost everything: reputation, the respect of the media world, friends who once flattered her now avoiding her. But what hurt her most wasn't the social losses. It was realizing that within the whole family, I was the only one who never used others as a stepping stone. "You may hate me. You have every right to. But if possible, I'd like to see you once. Not for the land, not for money, just to look at the sister I once thought was useless." I didn't reply immediately. I let the email sit for 2 days. I read it several times. Each time, I didn't feel anger, only a cold, quiet space like soil after rain. Finally, I sent back a single line. "Family is not blood, it's a choice." I wrote nothing more. No promise to meet, no reproach. Just a note to let her know that some doors, even when opened, no longer lead back to the old home. That night, I sat on the wooden bench by the row of corn tasseling. August had begun to soften. The wind carried the sharp scent of earth and newly rooted roots. Cole sat beside me and handed me a steaming cup of mint tea. His hand brushed mine, without words. I rested my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes. "They may be beginning to understand," I whispered. "But they may not have changed," Cole said. I nodded. "And I'm no longer responsible for making them change." We sat there a long time. Words weren't necessary. In the silence, I felt clearly one truth. Life doesn't have to be glamorous to be worth living. It only needs honesty. The choice I made, giving up, hollow recognition to sow a real life, day by day, season by season, on the ground where I stand, was enough. And now, I no longer need anyone's validation that it's right. One early autumn morning, with sunlight still clinging to the maple leaves behind the house, I received a thick envelope from Greenfield University, one of the country's most respected institutions for environmental and agricultural studies. The seal on the envelope was a deep red, with the formal marking, "Confidential, Academic Recognition." I drew out the letter and read it slowly. My hand trembled slightly when I reached the paragraph that said, "For outstanding contributions in research and application of sustainable organic farming models, combined with the transfer of biotechnologies to small-scale farming communities, we are honored to award Avery Jensen an honorary doctoral fellowship in environmental science." I sat in stunned silence for a few seconds. Then, for some reason, I laughed. Cole walked in wearing his old sweater, holding a basket of freshly pulled carrots. He looked at me, brow slightly furrowed. "What are you laughing at, like you just found a gold mine?" he asked. I stood up and held the letter up. "Not a gold mine, just recognition." He scanned it quickly, said nothing, set the basket down, and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "I never needed a certificate to know how good you are. But if they need this to begin believing, let them have it." 3 weeks later, Cole and I stood on the main stage at the National Agriculture Conference in Washington, D.C. Before us were more than 400 people, leading experts, university professors, farmers, and high school students attending through STEM sponsorship programs. I wore a simple beige linen dress. Cole wore a white shirt and khaki pants, no tie, no polish. We hadn't come to impress. We came to tell a story. I stepped up to the podium to a gentle round of applause. I looked down at the crowd and began. 15 years ago, when I chose to leave a research position at a major lab to live on a dry patch outside of Colorado, I had no map, no 5-year plan. I had one thing: a seed in my hand and faith. I told them about freezing mornings spent digging meter after meter, about the third drought year when we hauled buckets of water from a river half a mile away. I told them about my students' kids from the next town who came to intern, dirt under their nails, eyes lighting up at the sight of a potato pushing through the soil. Then I invited Cole up. He didn't need notes. He looked at the audience with steady eyes and a warm, low voice. We don't just grow vegetables. We replant faith in the soil, in water, and in people's ability to make amends, live differently, eat differently, and think differently. The talk ended with prolonged applause. A professor from the University of Michigan came up and shook my hand. You've inspired a new generation of researchers. Thank you for not giving up. I smiled and bowed slightly, but in my heart I was thinking of a different place somewhere far from stage lights and applause. That afternoon we returned to the farm. The air had a sharpness to it. Kale leaves swayed in the breeze. I shrugged off my coat, rolled up my sleeves, and went down to the south garden where we were testing the salt-tolerant kale variety developed by our lab in collaboration with the USDA. Cole came up behind me, holding his worn, cloth-covered notebook. Plot C3 is starting to show good results, I said, checking the thickness of the kale leaves and jotting notes. The soil here has more organic matter now, thanks to that biomulch you made, Cole said, pride in his voice. We were silent for a moment. Then he rested his hand on my shoulder, gently. When you plant a seed, you don't need anyone to believe in you. You just need time. I turned to look at him. The sky was the color of honey at dusk, casting long shadows of the two of us across the neat rows behind the house. I nodded, my voice small but clear. And now it's harvest season. Not just the season for kale or carrots. The season of patience, of faith. For people who choose the hard right path, I don't need anyone's applause. I don't need anyone's apology. I only need to know that after all those years living under the weight of my family's standards, I can still hold my head high, on my own land, with the hands that were once called dirty for touching soil. I looked out to the distance where the greenhouses glittered in the late sun, where new students were prepping for fall internships, where the future was no longer something to guess at, but something I'm planting day by day. What about you? If one day your family turns away and treats you like a shame, will you be strong enough to keep going without their approval? Or will you go back to save them just because you share blood? I used to think family was something you held on to at all costs. But after everything, I realized family isn't only where you're born. It's where you are respected, heard, and loved, unconditionally. Sometimes you have to build that family from scratch, with a partner who truly understands you, believes in you, and plants those first seeds with you. If my story makes you think of yourself or someone you know, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Sometimes your voice is the light that guides someone else through dark days. And if you want to keep walking with me not just through harvests, but through the storms, please subscribe to the channel. There are more stories about family, choices, and resilience waiting for you ahead. Thank you for staying until the very end.